This is a fish that can drown underwater, like actually drown. If you take this thing and hold it below the surface so it can't reach air, it will suffocate in perfectly clean water, which is a bit like a bird dying as it can't touch the ground. The African lungfish is basically a biological lawsuit against common sense. It has gills, but the gills don't work well enough to keep it alive. It has fins, but they're shaped like wet spaghetti. It has eyes, but they're mostly for show. And when its pond starts drying up and every other fish is dying in a panic, the lungfish just burrows into the mud, wraps itself in a sleeping bag made of its own slime, and takes a nap that can last multiple years in a cocoon. It looks like evolution forgot about it halfway through and just left it in the oven too long. I mean, look at this thing. But here's the thing, the lungfish has been doing this for 400 million years, which means it was here before trees existed, and it's still here now. So either this is the luckiest animal on Earth, or something about this absolute mess of a fish is working exactly as intended. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why the lungfish isn't a mistake. It's a fish built for a world that keeps trying to delete water, and every single thing that looks wrong about it is actually the reason it's still here. Everything about it looks broken until you realize what kind of nightmare it was designed to survive. So here's what a normal fish looks like. Streamlined body, fins that push water, gills that work, eyes that see things. The whole system is designed to move fast, catch food, not die. That's the baseline we're working with. Practically every single fish in the tanks behind me follows this sort of design, except for a few that I might show you on the channel. If we get to 1,000 subscribers, maybe I'll show you guys all my fish. So, like and subscribe. So, like the video and subscribe to the channel to see that. The lungfish has none of that. Its body is a tube with fins that don't push anything. It has gills that can't support it, and its eyes are basically just there for decoration, which raises a pretty reasonable question that you might be having. Why didn't evolution just fix it? Because evolution is supposed to be this process where the best designs win and the bad ones get deleted. Yet this fish has been showing up with the same problems for 400 million years. So either nobody's been checking the paperwork or something else is going on here. The answer is that the lungfish isn't behind. It's specialized, but not for normal water, which is where the confusion starts. Because when people think fish, they're picturing oceans or rivers or lakes where the water stays put and does its job. The lungfish is built for water that has a habit of disappearing without any notice. And when that happens, being fast and streamlined doesn't help you. So if you put a lungfish in the ocean, it dies every time. But if you put most fish in a drying swamp, they also die every time. And nature runs that second scenario every single year. So the lungfish gets called a living fossil a lot, which makes it sound like it's been sitting there doing nothing for hundreds of millions of years, but that's not what it means. Living fossil just means the design hasn't changed much because it didn't really need to, and that's actually harder to pull off than you would think, because most animals that were around 400 million years ago are extremely dead right now. The lungfish showed up during the Devonian period, back when fish were still figuring out what even being a fish meant, and the planet was covered in shallow, warm water that had a serious oxygen problem. If you were a fish trying to survive in a swamp where the water was hot and had almost no oxygen dissolved in it, you had two options. You could develop better gills and hope the water cooperated, or you could develop lungs and stop depending on the water to not betray you. The lungfish went with option 2, if you can't guess by the name. It turns out that was a pretty good call, because it's related to the group of fish that eventually crawled onto land and became everything with legs. So yeah, me and you, that's our grandfather. So when people say the lungfish looks primitive, what they mean is that it has features from back when fish were just starting to deal with the fact that water might not always be around, which sounds odd until you realize the lungfish's entire habitat is just water that shows up for a few months and then leaves in Africa. Evolution did not forget this fish. It handed it a toolkit specifically designed for places where the ground turns into a pond twice a year, and then the pond disappears. That is the whole job. Now, here's where that toolkit gets interesting, because the lungfish technically has gills, and those gills are attached to its body and everything, but they don't actually work well enough to keep it alive. They move water, they just don't pull enough oxygen out of it to matter. So the lungfish does what any reasonable fish would do when its gills stop doing their job. It breathes air. With lungs, yes, actual lungs, not some backup system or bonus feature, but a pair of spongy sacs inside its body that do about 90% of the work, which means this fish is running on the same respiratory system as you, except it still has to live underwater. This is actually different than a lot of other type of fish that breathe with a labyrinth organ, which is kind of like a lung, but isn't. There's a couple fish in my background that can do that, and they're more common. Lungfish, no, they got lungs. Every 20 to 30 minutes, a lungfish has to stop what it's doing, swim to the surface, stick its snout out, and gulp air. And if it doesn't, it dead, which means it's the only fish that has a mandatory appointment with the atmosphere just to stay conscious. The reason for this is that warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. The lungfish lives in water that's warm, stagnant, and sitting in the sun all day, which is the aquatic version of trying to breathe inside the bathroom in middle school when everyone's vaping. It is bad. Most fish would die in that situation, and if you were in that situation in middle school, you'd probably die too. But the lungfish solved the problem by opting out of the water breathing system entirely and going with plan B, which was air. Inside those lungs, there's a bunch of little sacs that increase the surface area for gas exchange. And when the lungfish gulps air, it uses something called a buccal pump, which means it shoves the air down its throat using its mouth muscles. And the air goes into the lungs where oxygen gets pulled into the blood. To make this work, the lungfish's heart has a partial wall in it that keeps oxygen-rich blood somewhat separated from oxygen-poor blood, so it doesn't immediately waste the oxygen it just worked to get. And that's a setup you'd normally see in amphibians, not fish. But here's the problem. Every time the lungfish surfaces to breathe, it's visible. And visibility in a swamp is not a neutral event, because there are birds standing in that swamp whose entire career is watching for things to surface, and they're pretty patient. Every breath is a risk. Surface and maybe get grabbed, or stay down and run out of air. And the lungfish does not enjoy either option. And speaking of not enjoying things, let's talk about the fins, because if the lungs are weird, the fins are just offensively bad at their job. A normal fish has fins that look like fins. They're wide, they're flat, they catch water, they push the fish forward. The whole design makes sense. You look at a fin and you think, yeah, that's gonna move something. This is the lungfish's fin. Look at it. The lungfish has fins that look like someone started drawing a fish, got bored, and just had an obsession with spaghetti. They're thin, they're stringy, and they flop around when the fish moves because they don't have enough surface area to push water in any meaningful way, which explains why the lungfish is one of the slowest swimmers in its habitat. The whole reason I got inspired to make this video is that I was at the fish store and this guy is like, hey, you want to see my pet lungfish? And I was like, yeah, I've seen it before. But he's like, no, have you seen it? And he just whips it out. He just takes it out of he just lifts it up, takes it out of its aquarium, and just holds it. I'm like, it just lets you do that? He's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. It can breathe air. It's fine. And the thing is just going with this like spaghetti noodle limbs. It's just going like this. I was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I've got to make a YouTube video about it because I don't think enough people know about this thing. Anyways, the thing I lied to you about is that those fins aren't trying to be swim fins. They're trying to be legs, or at least the evolutionary rough draft of legs. Because the lungfish is a lobe-finned fish, which means the fins have bones inside them arranged in a limb structure, and the lungfish uses them to crawl along the bottom of the swamp in an alternating pattern that looks disturbingly close to walking. Look at it. It doesn't walk well, it's not fast, but it can wedge itself into tight spaces, probe through mud for worms, push off rocks, and brace itself against plants, which are all things that matter when you live at the bottom of a muddy pool and spend most of your time looking for food in the dirt. So the lungfish traded speed for functionality in a low visibility, low movement environment where being able to shove yourself into a crack in the mud is worth more than being able to chase something. It's not underpowered, it's just optimized for a world where the fastest thing you ever need to outrun is the dry season. And this is where things get truly unhinged. I didn't even know about before I started researching this thing. Hold on, because this is gonna blow your mind. Because when the water starts shrinking and the other fish are realizing they're about to become dirt, the lungfish does something that most animals would consider a death sentence. It buries itself. Not in like a temporary hide and wait kind of way, but it buries itself in a mud, seals itself inside of a biological tomb, and then just stops doing things for months or sometimes years, which is not a normal response to a drought. But the lungfish committed to this strategy a long time ago, and it's too late to turn back now. Here is how it works. The water level drops, the mud thickens, and the lungfish starts wiggling down into it tail first, using its body to drill a tunnel about a foot or two below the surface. Once it's deep enough, it curls up into a U shape and stops moving. And then the weird part starts. The lungfish begins secreting mucus from its skin. A lot of mucus, enough mucus in fact to coat its entire body in a thick layer that starts out wet and then dries into a hard shell. And that shell becomes a cocoon that traps moisture inside and keeps the fish from turning into a raisin. The only part of the cocoon that stays open is a small tube near the mouth, which leads to the surface, and that tube is how the lungfish continues to breathe air while it's locked inside of a mud coffin. Then the metabolism shuts down, the lungfish's heart rate drops, its breathing slows, and it enters a state called estivation, which is the summer version of hibernation, except hibernating animals still wake up to eat and move around sometimes. Estivating lungfish do not. They don't eat, they don't move, they just exist in a state of low power mode, burning through their own stored energy to stay alive. To stay alive without food, the lungfish starts breaking down its own muscle tissue, which produces ammonia as waste, and ammonia is toxic. So the lungfish converts it into urea and just holds onto it until the water comes back. By the time it wakes up, its body is full of waste it couldn't get rid of, and it's lost a significant amount of weight because it's been eating itself for fuel, but it is still alive, which is the whole point. The usual duration for this is about 3 to 6 months, which lines up with most dry seasons in Africa, but lungfish have been documented surviving in dried mud for over 3 years in controlled conditions, which is an absurd length of time to not eat, not drink, and not move. If a human tried this, you'd be dead in about 3 days, possibly less if you were annoying about it. When the rain finally comes back and the mud softens, the cocoon dissolves and the lungfish wakes up. It does not celebrate. It doesn't do anything dramatic. It just wiggles out of the mud, takes a breath, and swims off to find food. Because from the lungfish's perspective, nothing unusual happened. This is just its life. The lungfish can't run from the drought. It can't migrate to better water. It can't do anything except dig in and wait. And that's exactly what it does, because waiting is free and movement costs energy. And in a habitat where water is unreliable, the lungfish that survives isn't the one that fights the hardest. It's the one that's willing to turn itself off until the problem goes away. This is why it looks weak. It is not a fish. It is a drought capsule with gills that don't work. So you're probably wondering where exactly this keeps happening, because it can't be everywhere, and you would be right. The lungfish lives in sub-Sahara Africa, spread across 4 different species in places that have one thing in common, which is that water shows up on a schedule and then leaves on a different schedule. And if you're a fish, again, that's a problem. The habitat is swamps, floodplains, slow rivers, and seasonal pools where the water sits in the sun all day getting warm and losing oxygen. During the wet season, everything floods and there's water everywhere and food is easy to find. Then the dry season hits and the water starts pulling a disappearing act. And this happens every single year without exception, which means every animal living there has to have a plan for when the ground stops being a pond. Most fish do not have a plan, they just die. The lungfish has a plan, and that plan is to stop being a fish temporarily and to become a mud statue that breathes through a straw. The water in these places sits between 24 and 30 degrees Celsius, which is warm enough that oxygen doesn't dissolve into it very well at all. So even when there is water, it's not great water. It's thick, it's stagnant, it's full of rotting plants, it stinks. If you ever walked across a puddle or something and that water is just rank and stinky, that's what happens when water is stagnant and gets warm. And if you put a fish in that water, they would be gasping at the surface because they don't have enough oxygen in there. They would die, which is why the lungfish does not bother with normal fish strategies. Lungfish don't care. Lungfish built different. Lungfish don't care about fish. Lungfish is evolving from fish. Can't be on the lungfish's tier. The lungfish spends most of its time on the bottom, buried in mud even when the water is still there, because it's a bottom dweller that doesn't trust the surface and doesn't really need to. The real enemy here isn't the other animals. The real enemy is the ecosystem deciding to stop being an ecosystem twice a year. Evolution didn't make this fish weird for fun. It made it weird because the habitat is hostile. And in that hostile habitat, the lungfish still has to eat something, which is where the tooth plates come in. Because the lungfish doesn't have normal teeth that you can point to individually. It has 2 big grinding surfaces in its mouth that work as a unit, and those surfaces are made of fused tooth material that forms ridges, which Sounds complicated until you realize it's just a built-in nutcracker. The lungfish eats snails, clams, worms, insects, small fish, frogs, and whatever plant material it accidentally scoops up while rooting through the mud, because it's an opportunist that takes what it can get, and what it can get depends on what's slow enough to catch. The lungfish is not a visual hunter. Its eyes barely work at all, so it relies on smell and on feeling vibrations in the water through its sensors in its skin. And when it detects something edible, it moves towards it slowly and then opens its mouth fast, which creates suction that pulls in water and mud and hopefully some worms. Then it crushes whatever it caught with the tooth plates, spits out the mud, and swallows the parts that aren't rocks. It's not elegant, but it works. The feeding schedule is infrequent because the lungfish has a slow metabolism and doesn't need to eat every day, and it can go weeks without food if it has to, which is good because when you live in a place where the water disappears for half the year, you need to be okay with not eating for months at a time. The lungfish, he's extremely okay with that. It is not a shark. It's just a patient bottom feeder with a jaw that handles hard targets. Now, you would think something this slow and weird would get eaten constantly by predators, but the lungfish has a defense strategy, and the strategy is to not be available, because if you're buried in hardened mud 2 feet underground, most predators are going to give up and find something easier. When the lungfish is young, it's vulnerable to everything bigger than it. Larger fish, wading birds, anything that eats small animals will eat a small lungfish, because small lungfish are just food with fins. But once a lungfish gets big, which can mean over a meter long and heavier than a small dog, the list of things that want to eat it gets shorter. The main threat becomes large wading birds that stand in shallow water and wait for fish to surface for air, which the lungfish has to do every half hour, and that's when it's visible. The other major predator is humans, because lungfish are eaten across Africa, and people dig them out of dried mud or catch them in shrinking pools and sell them in markets, which is a consistent problem for the lungfish, but it hasn't wiped them out yet. Mostly because they reproduce enough and hide well enough that the population stays stable. It's going to be pretty hard for humans to go find a bunch of lungfish if they're buried 2 feet in the ground. That's going to take a lot of work. Why not just get like a little fish in the pond that's easier? Literally, its main defense is just being hidden, camouflage, being slimy, and in some cases, it's underground, its cocoon where nothing can reach it. It is not fast, it is not attractive, it is not strong. It's just not there when you try to look for it. But here's what all of this actually means, because we started with the question of why the lungfish looks the way it does, and the answer is that it doesn't look wrong. It looks adapted, which is different. When people say the lungfish is primitive, what they usually mean is that it still has features from 400 million years ago. And that's true, but primitive doesn't mean bad, it just means old. It's kind of impressive that that's worked for that long. Think about every other animal on Earth. Most animals cannot say that they've been around for 400 million years. The lungfish didn't fail to evolve into a better fish. It evolved into a fish that solves a very specific problem, which is living in water that sometimes decides it's not water. There's no such thing as an evolutionary ladder where some animals are higher up than others, because evolution doesn't have a direction, it just has results, and the result here is that the lungfish traded away everything that makes a fish good at being a fish in normal water so that it could survive in water that disappears. It gave up speed, sharp vision, efficient water breathing, and powerful fins. In exchange, it got air breathing, drought survival, and the ability to shut down its own body for months without dying. Which sounds like a bad trade until you remember that the lungfish's entire habitat is a place where normal fish go to suffocate. If you judge the lungfish by the standards of a trout or bass, it loses every time. But if you judge it by the standards of surviving in a seasonal swamp that turns into cracked dirt for half the year, it's unbeatable, because it's the only fish that doesn't have to leave or die when the water does. So we are back to where it started, a fish that drowns underwater if it can't breathe air, which seems wrong until you realize it's not a water animal. It's a mud animal that needs water to move around in, and those are two very different jobs. The lungfish is also one of the closest living relatives to the fish that crawled onto land and became everything with legs, which means that when you look at a lungfish, you are looking at a preview of what it took to make that jump. Lungs, limb-like fins, the ability to survive in low oxygen environments, and most importantly, the ability to wait out bad conditions instead of trying to fight through them. That is the real skill here. Not speed, not strength, not being able to hunt well or see clearly. The skill was being able to pause and resume, which is what the lungfish does better than almost anything else. The strategy can be explained in this simple phrase: wait it out, the water comes back eventually. Other animals adapted to thrive. The lungfish adapted to not die, and it turns out That's the strategy that lasts. Maybe there's something we can all learn about the lungfish, because hey, it's been around 400 million years. Us humans, only a couple 100,000. So maybe one day we will all be living in the mud in cocoons as well. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and comment down below what you think of the lungfish. It's a really unique animal. I would love if other people could know about this thing, because it is crazy. Make sure to also subscribe to the channel and hit the hype button, the post notifications so you don't miss out on any of our future uploads. And if you want to watch another one of our videos, you can click the one that's on the screen right now.